Hello everyone, look where I'm at. That's right, I felt there was no better place to read this next chapter than the old classroom itself, to really help us all just feel like we're home again, listening to Mr. Hart read, just like we're back in the old classroom. So, for today, we are going to get into chapter 6, called The Snowy Heron. I realize now that it might not be super easy to see here, so let me get it a little bit closer for you guys. That is the actual plate of the snowy heron. That's what it would look like here. I know there's a picture in the front, but that is it in color for us all to see. Now, where we last left off in the book, if you guys can recall, in our last page, a big event happened where Doug kissed Lil Spicer. So that was definitely a very big moment. Also, Doug won a trivia contest, and his partner was none other than Mr. Big Bucks Ballard, the boss of his dad. We also found out that Doug's father stole the prize money that was supposed to go to Doug. He also stole a baseball that was signed by a bunch of Yankees, but in a first act of kindness, Doug's brother actually steals the ball for him, and he hands it to him and tells him to hide it. That way his brother doesn't see it again. So from there, we're going to begin our next chapter here, chapter 6, The Snowy Heron. But the thing about being a yellow shank is this. Once you move into the middle of the picture, you're that much closer to the dark woods. By the middle of November, it was pretty obvious that November in stupid Marysville, New York is about the crummiest month there is for running. You never know, things could get worse. But in November, the valley traps thick clouds and holds them low, so the air is always wet and cold. And every day, right around the time I went outside to run with James Russell and Otis Bottom, every day, and I'm not lying, it rained. And it rained the kind of gray rain that's only... Oh, wow. Somehow, a lot of my pages. Sorry, guys. A few degrees short of being snow and goes down your back. And pretty soon, like right away, your sweatshirt and t-shirt and all the rest of you are wet through. And they're so cold and you don't want them touching your skin, but what can you do? The one thing the cold made me do was pick up the pace. So even James Russell was panting by the time we got back. And Otis Bottom, he kept looking at me like he was wondering why we had to go on this all fired so fast. But I couldn't exactly go to Mr. Ferris's class in a sopping wet t-shirt. I had to change it before everyone else came back to the locker room because, well, you remember why I can't change in front of everybody else. James Russell and Otis Bottom figured it out, I guess. They never said anything when I took my dry clothes over to the bathroom stalls. But the week before Thanksgiving, things got darker in PE. The so-called gym teacher announced that we were going to start a new unit, volleyball. And everyone, and that meant everyone, was going to cheerfully participate because this was a team sport that required every single one of us to be part of the team. Terrific. So we strung up nets while he sat in his office and he used masking tapes to mark off the boundaries, and we knocked the balls around some and then served overhand as if we knew what we were doing. And the so-called gym teacher came out of his office and said that we were supposed to practice passing back and forth, which he never told us. And we went back into his office and we passed back and forth until we all got sick of it. And then we started dodgeball with the volleyballs until the so-called gym teacher came out of his office again and hollered that was pretty much the end of the period. It was one more blah day at Washington Irving Junior High School. Except that in English the next day, a runner from the principal's office came in and handed Miss Cowper a note. She read it and looked at me. Douglas, Principal Petey would like you to stop by after school. Every eye in the classroom turns towards me. They probably figured that my twisted criminal mind had made me do something awful again. How come? I said. If you mean to say why has the principal requested to see me, my answer is I do not know. But I'm sure he will tell you. I'm sure he will, said about 22 voices around me. That'll do, class, said Miss Cowper, with one last look at me, a little worried maybe. She turned to the chalkboard. Lil leaned over. What did you do? I shrugged. Do I have to do anything? Pretty much you don't have to go see the principal unless you've done something, Doug. All right, I'll tell you. Principal Petey has a mad wife that he's hiding her in the school attic. Except every so often she escapes. The school, said Lil, doesn't have an attic. Well, in that case, it's a basement. I went down by accident, and there she was, and she came at me, Mrs. Petey, like she was going to bite me to death or something. But I got away, and now Principal Petey wants me to keep me quiet. He'll probably lock me up too, and then, Lil, you alone are going to know this terrible secret. I should tell you that I was revealing this terrible secret to Lil while Miss Cowper was trying to teach us the wonders of the adverb, and that when she asked if Lil and I had anything we'd like to share with the whole class, we stopped, quickly understanding that was Mrs. Cowper's way of telling us to stop. She was watching us angrily and would beat us mercilessly if we ever decided to continue this. And I'm giving you that last sentence just to show you that you can too talk and learn at the same time. Principal Petey made me wait for half an hour. Again. I guess it was his technique. Then he opened the door and stood and told me to come in and to sit. And then we sat behind the desk and underneath the brown pelican, and he looked at me like I was personally responsible for causing all the problems at Washington Irving Junior High School. He shook his head a couple times before he began. I'm not lying. This brown pelican was beautiful over his desk. He could have been as funny looking as the large-billed puffins because he was mostly Bill. Put him next to the Arctic tern and you would hardly imagine him flying. The feet, that curved neck, the colors, oh gosh, he could have been a hoot. But he wasn't. When you looked at him, it didn't matter how he was put together because he was noble. If you were a bird, you could imagine bowing down to him. Principal Petey has been speaking with Coach Reed. You'd have to wonder what the brown pelicans would look like if he were to speak something deep but still able to laugh. Warm, easy. Coach Reed says, Douglas, would you mind giving Principal Petey your full attention? You can imagine the brown pelican standing over the brown-backed gull at that moment when the gull most needed him and saying that maybe the sky wouldn't be lost after all. Listen, kiddo, you took Principal Petey in the eye. You look him in the eye right now. So I did. I looked him in the eye, but it wasn't easy. I said, Principal Petey has been speaking with Coach Reed. You remember that feeling of how cold, freezing rain would hit your back that I was telling you about? Principal Petey held up a piece of paper. Coach Reed has had the secretary type up this report for your permanent school record. Just so you know, I should tell you this. I did not say, I didn't know the so-called gym teacher could even write a report. I did not say that, even though I was tempted. I didn't say it, though. Sometimes I really do get it. I know how to play the game. He tells Principal Petey that you have been cutting his class for weeks. I've been running, and he sees me go out every day at the beginning of the period. Has your class been doing a running unit? No, but I have. The rest of your class hasn't, and guess what? You're not the teacher. He looked down at the paper. It was a blue piece of paper, which I guess made it all fired important. It says you've missed the entire wrestling unit. I didn't say anything. How are you going to make that up? I still didn't say anything. I figured that keeping my mouth shut was my best option. See, I got it. I know how to play the game. Principal Petey will tell you how you're going to make that up. Coach Reed staggers his units, so he'll be starting one of the wrestling units' 5th period class. You'll be there for that one, and don't think of missing a day. No, Principal Petey, that's my lunch period. 5th period was your lunch period, but no longer, he said. Wait, do I still have to do his... Yes, you'll still have the other period with him, too. Principal Petey looked at the blue piece of paper. That'll be volleyball. He must really love me if he wants to see me twice a day. He does not, said Principal Petey. And then he said something to me, and I don't want to tell you what he said. It was something awful, though. It only gets me closer, though, to that dark, dark woods. Principal Petey said something here, guys, that must have really, really shocked Doug, because Doug doesn't do this very often. He hears a lot of terrible comments from his dad, a lot of terrible comments from Principal Petey, a lot of terrible comments from Coach Reed. But whatever this was really shook him to the core. Does anyone have any guesses maybe what he said to him? Yes, back here. What do you think? I don't know. How about over here? Any thoughts? All right, guys. Saturday deliveries in November are, of course, cold and gray and wet. The sky is dark and lousy, as if the background as in the background of Snowy Heron, which is the Audubon picture that Mr. Powell had turned to because he wanted me to think about the composition on several planes at once. But things weren't like they had been in October. On Saturdays now, Mrs. Mason was taking out a couple of donuts again from the 24 I was bringing, and she was putting them on a white plate and setting them beside the mug of hot chocolate that was waiting for me. And Mr. Loeffler, who was reading Jane Eyre because he said I inspired him, he liked to tell me that I should see the movie with Orson Welles sometime. And then he'd act out a scene or two, and we'd start to laugh because Mr. Loeffler is no actor, and I'm not lying. Afterwards, we'd change whatever light bulbs needed changing. And then when I got to the Doherty's house, Phronsie and Davy and Joel and Polly and Ben would all be waiting to tackle me, and I let them. I never came away from them without 2 or 3 new bruises somewhere. But it was great. And Mrs. Windermere? You know how cold it gets when you're walking out to Mrs. Windermere's and Mrs. Mason's hot chocolate is a long time gone and it's misting and freezing and Joe Pepitone's jacket isn't warm as it could be and you have to walk fast so you don't start to shiver, but you can't walk too fast because you don't want to tip the stupid wagon over. It's that cold. So when you walk to Mrs. Windermere's kitchen and it's a warm and cozy like my mother would keep her kitchen, and you hear Mrs. Windermere typing the distance, with that god of creativity probably sitting right next to her with its wings folded, you take your time because you don't want to go out into that cold again. And besides, there's the road-threaded divers to look at and wonder what spectacular thing the mother diver is thinking about showing her next kid. And then Mrs. Windermere comes in and says, "Skinny delivery boy, do you want a cup of coffee?" I'm not lying. She offered me coffee. And I say, "Sure." And she says, "How do you take it?" And I say, "Black." And she says, "Fine." And I'm warm all over the place. I'm warm my entire way back home. And then on November Saturday nights, I'd be over at the Dohertys, who decide to give me a chance after all and let me babysit. Maybe they were desperate. Mrs. Doherty wasn't kidding. 5 kids, and every single one of them needed to get read to before they went to sleep. And it wasn't like you could read to all 5 of them at once, or even 3 of them, or 2. It was 5 kids. 5 books. This takes a long time. I'm not lying. But I didn't care because I figured it all out thanks to Miss Cowper's County Literacy Unit. I figured out Sam I Am for Phronsie. I figured out Circus McGurkus for Davy. I figured out Jack, Knack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Quack, Pack, and Quack for Joel. And I figured out Andy and the Thorn and the Lion's Paw for Polly. And I even figured out why Wilbur is one terrific pig for Ben. You know what it feels like to figure all this stuff out? Do you really know what it feels like? And after the Dohertys came in that night, Mr. Doherty would drive me back to the dump in his police car. So you might think that's what things were going pretty well. And you know what? That moment things were going pretty well. But even while eating cinnamon donuts and changing white light bulbs and walking back from the Windermere's and driving to the dump in a police car and working on that Snowy Heron, I always, in the back of my mind, would be thinking about what Principal Petey had said to me on that day. And you don't really care about the composition of several planes at once when you're thinking about something that horrific that he told me. "Look at the diagonals that Audubon sets up first," Mr. Powell said. "Go from the tip to the heron's feet to the tip of the beak, and you have the first diagonal. But look at the second diagonal. It's a lot subtler. He starts at the end of this broad leaf in the upper left, right here, and then brings it down across the top edge of his broad leaf, and the bottom edge of this rise in the shore. And the 2 diagonals form." He waited. "They form an X," I said. "Exactly right. And the center of that X is the lake, which is drawn linearly, long and narrow. Do you see?" "Yeah, I got it." "So, you have one plane of action in the forefront, marking by diagonals, and in that one, the heron is stepping out from the higher brush and is trampling the plant. And the other plane, the one on the horizontal, the hunter is in the background, holding his gun and advancing." I nodded. God, all I could think about, though, was Principal Petey is a jerk. What's interesting is that the 2 planes are going to come together soon after that moment we are seeing, because both the bird and the hunter are approaching the center of the diagonals, which in a composition such as this always intersects at the middle of the page, just like the action will intersect at the middle of the page. "It doesn't look like the heron is going to come off too well," I said. Mr. Powell looked at me, the approaching hunter. Yes, probably not. It doesn't look too good for the heron. So this is one dead heron we're looking at, isn't it? Lil got up from the table where she was doing her English class exercise that we were both supposed to show us all the wonders of the adverb. She looked at the snowy heron. He doesn't look dead to me, she said. Shows how much you know, I said. Okay, I get it. I was starting to sound like Lucas again. And a dumb. I know, but nobody else in the room had Principal Petey tell him that. Nobody else in the room knew it was like to have somebody blast away at him the way Principal Petey had blasted away at me. Like this heron. I, at that moment, felt just like this heron. I knew what the heron was going to find out. Lil went back to doing her adverbs, and Mr. Powell, he was quiet. Then he got out a sheet of paper. Try drawing the contour of the heron without a line. I suggest the feathers, he said, at least until you get back to the base of the neck. I tried, but I couldn't get it. And after Lil closed her book and got up and left without saying a thing, I didn't even want to try to get it. Mr. Switek, take the paper home, and I want you to try it there. I shook my head, and I left the pencils and paper there. I left that snowy heron there, too, forever in that moment before he was going to get blasted, which he had no idea was coming. God, that snowy heron didn't know how lucky he was. On the day before Thanksgiving, we got a postcard from Lucas, but it still wasn't in his handwriting. He'd be back by the middle of December. Remember, I gotta look exactly the same, someone wrote to him. My mother cried. It says, remember, I don't look exactly the same, someone wrote for him. My mother cried, and she said that we had a lot to do to be thankful for this Thanksgiving. And I guess that was true, especially since Mr. Ballard sent home a 22-pound turkey, which, I'm not lying, is a big turkey for every one of his employees. And on Thanksgiving Day, my mother put it right over as she got up, and it cooked all morning and half the afternoon, so the whole house was filled with the scent of it. My mother went around smiling. Well, that was until Ernie Echo came over. And on the Monday after Thanksgiving, I went to 5th period phys ed class instead of lunch. I sat down at the end of the squad lines, and the so-called gym teacher made us count off by twos. No, I didn't say anything about how this was probably as high as he could count. And then he divided us into 2 platoons and told each platoon to line up by height, which it did take a lot longer than you might think. And then he told us to sit on opposite sides of the mat spread across from the floor to see who our opponents would be. It was supposed to generate aggression, he said. Psh, terrific. And you have to wonder if the world is fair when it was one of those late fall days in stupid Marysville when tropical front of something had come up from who knows where, South America, and everything was warm and yellow sun was shining, and what a sweet day it would be to run or to eat lunch outside. But instead, I was messing around on a gray mat that smelled like sweat and 1,000 wrestling matches. It was, I had to admit, hard to give that wrestling unit my full attention. Here are my stats for the first matches of the period, though. 1 takedown of me. 1 pin of me. 1 loss for me. Match time, 8 seconds. I guess you can tell I wasn't paying too much attention. And the so-called gym teacher came up behind me before my second match, while my opponent was staring at me from across, generating aggression. I'm not going to pass you for this unit if you don't try, he said. And here are my stats for the second match. 1 takedown of me. 1 pin of me. A second loss for me. Match time 32 seconds, which is 4.5 times longer than the first match. The so-called gym teacher, though, he eyed me from the other side of the mat, and I eyed him back. Then he leaned down and said something to my next opponent, who turned to look at me. And the so-called gym teacher said something to him again, and then he walked away. It was sort of creepy. Like you wore the snowy heron and you could feel that something was wrong, but you didn't exactly know what. Because you hadn't seen the hunter with the gun coming across the horizon yet. But I'm not lying. The stats of that third match, they were different. And when the so-called gym teacher blew his stupid whistle, this other guy and I got in a circle, and I crouched down as if I cared at all. And we started to circle each other, and he said, Reed wants me to call you a mama's baby. I almost lunged at his throat at that moment. But I'm not. We circled some more. He's a jerk, the guy said. Let's get something going, hollered the so-called gym teacher. And we circled some more. And then we kept back to the so-called gym teacher. And I said, keep circling. And so we did. And someone on the edge of the mat at that moment started to laugh. And then someone else. And then we started to circle faster. And pretty soon the whole place was laughing except for the so-called gym teacher. And this kid and I were laughing so hard that we could hardly keep circling, but we just kept going until we were dizzy. And finally, this so-called gym teacher hollered us to sit down, and we did, except we were both kept swaying because we were so dizzy. And then the so-called gym teacher was about to get angry, as you can see a teacher get. And when he called the next two guys up for their match, he could hardly keep the roar from his sergeant voice. But you know what the two guys did? That's right. They just kept circling. They circled. And they circled. I think you can imagine what the so-called gym teacher did. If it had been legal, I think he would have called in the firing squads. But since it wasn't legal, he told us that we had to get going to give every boy in the class a big fat 0 for the day. And we could see how we all like that. Yes, sirree, Buster. But we all went in to get changed. And at that moment, we were all still laughing. No one in the locker room looked when I took my shirt off. Maybe the snowy heron is going to come off pretty badly when the plane does come together. Maybe. But at that moment, I think the snowy heron was still proud and pretty beautiful. His head was held high, and he's got his sharp beak that's running across his face to the world. You know what? That snowy heron is okay for now. Roll credits. Guys, I want you to know something about this unit. Did you guys, I don't know if it stuck out to you at all, but who has to do this unit here? Doug, right? He's the only one who's getting punished. Is there anything weird about that stands out to you? I really wish one of you guys were here to answer this right now. But what stands out to me is, like, Doug wasn't alone, right? Like, his friends also were part of this, so that's weird. I also am very curious about Lucas. There's now been 2 letters from him, and both times it was not in his handwriting. And he also definitely says in the letters, he warns that he does not look the same. So I want us to think about that too. What could be wrong with him? Okay, guys, sorry. On that first Saturday of December, the next month that Lucas was coming home, I waited for Lil outside the library for deliveries. It was cold, and I'm not lying. The sky was iron, and Mrs. Windermere's coffee was worn off before I got back into town, even before I passed the open meadow. A few snowflakes blew past in a hurry, which is how most people went by too, all huddled together and their heads down and their arms close in. So you can see it was kind of noble of me to wait outside for her. But I hadn't really talked to her since Thanksgiving, and I guess I wanted to make sure that she wasn't still thinking of my stupid "shows how much you know" comment. But I was still thinking about what Principal Petey's stupid comment that he made to me. What he said. She came up the street with a load of books and stomped up the 6 steps to where I was waiting, and I said, "Hey!" And she said, "Hey." But she said it in a way that meant she wasn't really saying hey. What she was saying was, "You are such a jerk, and I wish you would just drop dead into some tract." So I knew she hadn't forgotten. "Are you coming to the library?" I said. And she looked at me like she was generating aggression, and she said, "Not now." "Well, I wish you would. It's not that much fun just drawing with only Mr. Powell." "Oh, I didn't realize." "Well, I don't know very much about it, do I?" "If we could stop at your dad's deli, maybe we can get 2 Cokes." "Do you have any money?" she said. "No," I said. "Then what you're really saying is if we stopped at my dad's deli, I could get you a Coke, right?" I shrugged and smiled. Lil Spicer shook her head, and then she laughed. And I'm not lying, she smiled too. "You know, you should smile more often." She handed me her books, and she took my arm. "Let's go," she said. That afternoon, after our Cokes, I drew the snowy heron like I was James Audubon himself. Except my heron, he was strutting out in the world like that hunter would never come. Finally, in the middle of December, we drove to New York City in my father's new pickup, my father, my mother, and me. We left my brother at home, first because we couldn't have room in the car for him in the pickup once Lucas got there, and second because my father wanted him to move the furniture around in our bedroom upstairs so that we could fit another bed in it. That was going to be easy, which my brother had pointed out, and which my father had answered him back with, well, you know how he answered him back. I sat between them, my mother My father was glaring at the cars on the expressway as if they were daring them to even try dinging up his new pickup truck. I wasn't sure why he was so fired up and worried about it. It was already pretty dinged up after all. You don't get a whole lot of $100 down payments. You don't get a whole lot when you only give a $100 down payment, I guess. But whenever someone got close to him, he would roll down his window and he would let them know, even though they had their windows rolled up because it was about 0 degrees outside. Of course, when my father dropped his window, it made it about 0 degrees inside too. And it didn't get warm again because the heater in our car didn't work in this new pickup. I guess he forgot when he bought it that we weren't living in, say, I don't know, Miami. My mother was wearing her best blue coat. She looked out the window too most of the time. It was like she was trying to peer across for miles right into the city to find Lucas. Every time a bus passed us, she looked out all the windows. Who knew he might be there? Me, though, at that moment I was watching Joe Pepitone whenever a Ford Mustang drove by, because Joe Pepitone is the kind of guy who would drive a Ford Mustang. We got lost 3 times in New York City because my father said no one ever knew where they were doing when they laid out the streets in New York City. Nothing even makes sense here, he would say. And if you were there, you wouldn't either have pointed out that it made perfect sense because the whole city is on a grid. You know you wouldn't have. There's no way you're saying that to my dad. When we finally got to the Port Authority bus station, we drove past it 8 times because he wasn't going to park in one of those garages where they take your money and then go joyriding in a truck. Not him. He was going to find a spot in the street, which we finally did about a half a mile away, which took a whole lot longer to drive than you might think because we had to creak through to a stop in the war protest that was going on. It was spilling on the streets into all sides. By the time my father edged the pickup into the spot, my mother was near frantic. When we finally switched off the ignition, she got out, and I got out, and my mother started to walk towards the Port Authority. "Just hold on," my father said. "If we don't hurry, we won't get there when the bus pulls in." "So what? He's been gone a whole..." And at this moment, though, my mother, she didn't even wait for him to finish her sentence. She turned away, and she just began walking. At that moment, I could have cheered. And so, we were there on the bottom level of the Port Authority, and Lucas's bus pulled in. My father, came in a couple minutes after us. I wish I could tell you what it was like watching my mother smile while that bus parked. I wish I could tell you. But maybe you know, and I don't have to tell you. There was the smell of diesel and the screech of air brakes and the big engine of the bus echoing off the cement walls and ceiling. There was the crowd of people all looking for something they cared about, who was on the bus and who was coming home for Christmas. There was the driver switching off the engine, taking off his hat and stretching, pulling back hair. He reached forward and pulled a lever and the doors opened and he got out and stretched again. And then he walked over to the luggage bins and bent to open them. And there were the passengers starting to get out. And they were there, but none of them were Lucas. And they walked slow and unsteady, like they had been crinkled up a while on a seat too small. And one by one, they turned to the crowd and they waved at someone. And someone would run up and they'd hug and they'd kiss. And then they would go find their luggage. And that's how it was. One by one, everyone was coming off the bus, holding the rail as they stepped out, until everyone was off that bus, and even the bus driver was standing by the empty luggage bins, closing them up. And then he looked over to us. "You folks waiting for a kid in a wheelchair?" he said. "No," my father said. But my mother gasped. And then she was running. She flew past the bus driver and onto the stairs of the bus. We could hear her steps as she ran to the back. I came up behind her, and this is what I saw. My mother was at that moment kneeling down in front of my brother Lucas. One of the overhead lights was shining brightly on her hair, turning it all gold. She held Lucas's face in both her hands. Her blue coat was spread out, and it was covered them both like wide wings covered even the chair my brother was sitting in. She was kissing him, but I couldn't see his face until she reached to hold him close to her, and she put her head beside his. Then I could see him. I could see the wide gauze bandage across his eyes. And oh God, it wasn't until she stood and turned to me that I could see why Lucas was in that chair. Both of his legs were missing above the knees. My mother looked at me, and she gave me that smile. Next to them stood a smart soldier, his uniform perfect, his hat off his arm, looking away like he was not supposed to be seeing this. I walked down the aisle, touching each of the seats as I passed them, and my mother walked up each step I took. When I was in front of the wheelchair, she put her hand on the back of my brother's head, and he leaned into her. "Lucas!" He tilted his face up at me. "Hey, Doug," he said. He reached out, and I took his hand. It was trembling a little. "I guess I got a little dinged up," he said. A little bit," I said. And he smiled. I never saw that smile before, but his smile was just like my mother's. The soldier and I got Lucas down from the bus. It wasn't easy, and I think we hurt Lucas twice trying to get him down those bus steps. And again when we crowned him into the elevator. And again when we crowned him out of the elevator. But he never said a thing. And when we finally got him to the ground floor, he reached out, and the other soldier shook his hand, and Lucas said, "Thank you, sir." And the soldier said, "It was my honor." And he saluted Lucas, who couldn't see him, but Lucas saluted back as if somehow he knew. Then my mother took his hand, and I got behind the chair, and I pushed him through the Port Authority and out onto the street. "Where are we?" he said. "New York City," I said. He lifted his face up in the air. The bright, cold sunshine shone down on him, but he couldn't see it. He was smelling instead. And then he turned his head because he was hearing what suddenly we were all hearing. The Stop the War protest was marching towards us. People holding up signs and letters that dripped like blood, screaming into bullhorns, chanting and sort of looking like the hunter coming across the horizontal to the meeting of the diagonals, which is where we were standing. And when the marchers in front of us saw us, they tried to hold back, but the power of the marchers behind heaved them forward. And so instead, they turned sideways and skirted around us until we were in a pocket with the crowd touching us everywhere. And you know what they said when they saw my brother in this uniform sitting in a wheelchair with bandages all around his eyes and his legs gone? Do you know what they yelled at us? Do you know what these protesters said to us? They said that my brother got what he deserved. They said that they were glad that his legs were gone. They said that they were glad that his eyes were gone. They said that he had got done to him what he did to every Vietnamese baby. And how did he like it now? They said that's what happens when you let yourself get used by fascist pigs. My mother tried to get in front of Lucas, but the crowd was so thick and so close that she couldn't work herself around the wheelchair. She looked back at my father, and he pushed himself past her and stood in front of Lucas, who sat there the whole time, facing straight out, even when someone spit on him. He didn't say anything. He just took it like there was nothing else that he could even do. Do you know what that feels like? Do you know what it feels like at that moment to see someone do that? It feels like having Principal Petey tell you that not a single teacher in the whole school gives a rip about you. Not a rip! Because they all gave up on you a long time ago. Like the day that you started. That's what it feels like to see them treat your brother like this. It probably went on like that for only a few minutes, but it felt way longer. And when the crowd finally thinned out and the last protester had hated him, we got back into the pickup and my father started up while my mother and I helped Lucas out of that wheelchair and into the cab. And my father swore when he had to get out after my mother came around the front to get in through the driver's side. I got in the back and pulled the wheelchair into the pickup. It was heavier than I thought it would be, and I had to be careful because my father sure hoped I wasn't dinging up his pickup while I was getting that wheelchair into it. I put the wheelchair down on its side and leaned against it so it wouldn't roll around as we headed out to Manhattan and back towards Marysville to a house my brother had never seen. And honestly, I guess he never would see it now. It was a long drive, and I think you can imagine how cold it was for one of us especially. But I kept wondering every time we hit a bump on that stupid shocks of the pickup if it didn't actually hurt Lucas a lot. It probably hurt him a lot. When we pulled into the driveway, my father got out, and he went straight into the dump. He didn't help us. I lowered the wheelchair over the side, and I jumped down and opened the door. Lucas's face was pretty grim. I'm not lying. My mother had been crying, so her face was pretty grim too. I wasn't sure exactly how we were going to get Lucas into the pickup, especially when we were just going to hurt him more. I guess he wondered about that too, because he said, "Doug, if you just wheel the thing below me, maybe I could just sort of fall into it. It took me a couple seconds to see that he was kidding, even though there was nothing funny about missing your legs, you know. And then the front door of the dump opened, and I thought it was probably my father coming back to help out, but it wasn't. It was my brother. He looked at me, and then he looked inside the truck of my mother and Lucas. "Hey, Lucas," he said. "Hey." My brother looked at me again, and then he reached into the pickup. "Tell me if this hurts," he said, and he reached around Lucas, and Lucas reached an arm around my brother's neck, and he lifted him out of the chair just like that, and let him down off the wheelchair. "Thanks, little brother." And my brother Christopher, he said, "Anytime, Lucas, whatever you want." And so we wheeled Lucas into the dump, and my father said, "How did we think we were going to get him up to our room in a wheelchair?" And Christopher said, "We got this. We'll figure it out. You just mind your business." And at that moment, Lucas gave us that smile. Guys, a couple things I do want to stop and point out here. I'm sorry, but we have a gap. First off, it should be noted that, like, if you don't know this about Vietnam War, it was an awful war in our history. But the thing about Vietnam War was most of the people in it were drafted, which means Lucas would not have volunteered to be in the war. He would have been drafted and forced to fight. I only say that because I just want to point out how horrific it is that these people are protesting and literally spitting on him for coming back, because Lucas had no choice whatsoever. He was drafted. He was forced to fight. Also, there's something about Christopher, and I'm going to ask this on the about Luke. Sorry, there's something about the brother of Doug's younger brother, that we just learned about in this coming page. I want you guys to think, what did we not know about Doug's youngest brother until right now? Something that the author has left out. I want you guys to think, what was that thing, and why do you think the author waited till now to finally tell us that thing about his younger brother? I really did try to care about the volleyball unit in PE that week, but if you have to admit, a volleyball is not that great of a sport. You don't hear Jim McKay announcing the thrill of victory that comes from winning a volleyball game. I mean, slapping a ball around and getting over a net. What's the point of that? There's a reason that no one carries stats about volleyball around in their head, but I really did try to care, and I even tried to care about the wrestling unit. Not enough to try to win or anything, but enough to keep things going for a minute or two without a whole lot of circling, which the so-called gym teacher announced would get 2 circlers, big fat zeros. And no, I didn't say a thing about my surprise at him being able to understand the mathematical concept of a zero. Remember, I understood how things work now. And I didn't even complain about having to be in the wrestling unit at all, which I had a reason to, since you may have noticed that James Russell and Otis Bottom weren't there with me, even though they had missed most of the wrestling unit too. But so what? So what? If the so-called gym teacher wants to be the jerk of the world, so what? He wants to boom around in his sergeant voice, so what? But maybe you can understand a little when I tell you that when the so-called gym teacher hollered at me during a volleyball that I should go after the balls and not act like a mama's baby, you can understand why I got the volleyball and was about to throw it as hard as I could at his sneering face. But I held back, and I'm not lying, it wasn't easy. And I told him to shut up. Just shut up, and he sneered some more and said that I would never throw the volleyball because I knew what would happen to me, and my mother would be all upset, wouldn't she? But still, I almost threw it. I almost threw it at him. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, the way Lil Spicer likes. And then at that moment, I took off my shirt and I threw it to the bleachers. I went back and I served that stupid ball over the stupid net overhand. Stats for the game. I don't remember. My platoon lost, and it's volleyball. Who cares? It wasn't exactly the agony of defeat, because at that moment, I had won, and it was a whole lot better. But I'm not lying. All that week, the so-called gym teacher did not let up. On Tuesday, he made the guys in the wrestling unit run the bleachers all period because they weren't trying hard enough. And guess who was one of those 3 guys? Then later during volleyball, he made 2 of the guys clean off the scuff marks from the gym floor of the old tennis balls. And guess who was one of those 2 guys? And on Wednesday, when the wrestling unit, he made 2 guys run the bleachers all period because they weren't trying hard enough. Guess who was one of those 2? And in volleyball, I had to finish all the scuff marks I missed on my side of the floor. And on Thursday, he had 4 guys finally wash the sweaty wrestling mats down. And guess who was one of those 4? And in volleyball, he told 4 guys that they were going to stand in the middle of the court and try to retrieve balls that were spiked down to them. We were supposed to dive. You know what that feels like, diving onto a gym floor for 43 minutes? And then he told us the next day that would be a stunning climax of the wrestling and volleyball units. Terrific. So on Friday, the last day before Christmas vacation, the so-called gym teacher said he had picked random wrestling partners by choosing our names from slips of paper he'd cut up and put into a hat. He held his clipboard, and he said he'd call in the names 2 by 2, starting with the first pair to wrestle. And guess who was in that first pair? My partner turned out to be Alfred Hartnett. I'll let you guess again. Do you think Alfred Hartnett weighed about the same as me, or do you think he weighed about 16 times more than me? Yeah, you're smart enough to guess. The so-called gym teacher smiled when he called my name, and then Alfred Hartnett's. He put his clipboard down on the bleachers and said, "Let's get it going," he said. And I'm not lying, even if I had been trying, it wouldn't have been made any difference, because Alfred Hartnett just laid an arm across me and I went down. It was, for the record, his left arm, not his strong side, because, Alfred was a good guy. The so-called gym teacher thought it was hilarious, though, and after the period, he went back into the office and left 2 guys, me and Alfred Hartnett, hilarious to roll up the mats for Christmas vacation. They weren't bad, so, because, as you might remember, they just gotten cleaned early in the week. And when we finished, we walked back towards the locker room, and I saw the so-called gym teacher had left his clipboard of slips on the bleachers. At that moment, I looked at his clipboard. Wouldn't you have wanted to know? But there was not a single name on it. The so-called gym teacher had set it all up, but there wasn't anything random at all about this, the jerk. I flipped over the page, and it was blank too. "Hey, Alfred!" I flipped over another page, and at this time it wasn't blank. It was a drawing of James Russell going for a layup, and behind him you could make out every kid in our platoon. I'm not lying, the so-called gym teacher knew something was about composition on several planes at once, too, in his drawings. And then I flipped over to another page, and there was Otis Bottom hanging about halfway off the climbing rope, looking like there was no way in creation he was going to ever get up any higher. Another page, there was me, running. Another page, our whole platoon again smacking volleyballs around. And another one, our whole platoon really playing volleyball this time. Me serving, no shirt, and there was also no tattoo. I looked up for a while, and then I skipped some pages and turned to the back of the pad. And then I stopped, because there was a drawing of a low road between grasses, and there were bodies, lots of bodies. They were all jumbled and thrown on the top of a paper. Another page. A Vietnamese man, he was wooled and worn, and the Vietnamese man was dead. His eyes open and his body was lying crooked on the ground. And behind them there was a young girl who was naked, reaching for his hand, but she never made it. There was another page. A boy, younger than me, a straw hat broken underneath. His face, what was left of it, was with just one terrified eye. There was burning huts behind him, bodies all around the road too, in those huts. The words, "My lay," were at the bottom, and I was there. "Swiatek, what do you think you're doing?" It was the so-called gym teacher. He came across the room like a thunderhead bearing down the valley and grabbed the clipboard out of my hands. "What are you doing, looking at my personal things?" "Coach," I said. "You get out of here!" He was screaming, shrieking like a sergeant. "Get out of here! Never touch my things again! Do you hear me? Get out!" I went to my locker room to change, and later that day, Miss Cowper and I didn't ask for that. It just seemed to happen. Miss Cowper wrote an excuse from PE so that I could help her refresh in the county literacy unit. I never did find out what the stunning climax, though, was of that volleyball unit. Lucas didn't talk much, and when he did talk, it was never around my father. It was mostly around my mother. You could hear them late at night whenever everything was quiet and dark. There would be these low voices, then quiet, and then the low voices again, and sometimes crying. And every night, when they were alone, my mother would change the gauze bandages around his eyes. Then her voice would call quietly at the stairs, and Christopher would go down to bring Lucas up to her bedroom. He wouldn't talk about what happened, how he lost his legs and maybe his eyes. And sometimes you'd come into the kitchen, and he would be sitting in the kitchen table where the sunlight was coming in, and he'd have his face raised to it like he would see its warmth. Sometimes you saw him try to lift his body up and down in the chair like he was trying to lift a weight, which he pretty much was. And sometimes he would get letters from people in the unit or from doctors and nurses who worked on him after he was wounded. I told him I would read them for him, but he never wanted me to. He told me to just throw them all away, but I never did. His stumps hurt him, and sometimes he would reach down to where his legs used to be, and he would want to scratch them, but there was no place to scratch. He'd still try, though, and then he'd give up and put his hands over his face, and you could tell what he was doing. He could not let himself think that everything was ruined forever. We were supposed to go down with Lucas to see a doctor in New York City every 2 weeks, for who knows how long, but my father said he wouldn't be traipsing him all over the state every 2 weeks. So we found a doctor in Kingston who would see him. And when my father put up an all-fired fuss at the first visit about how much it would cost, the doctor said that his son was in Vietnam too right now. He was a medic. So with that, he would take Lucas for as long as his son was over there. And my father said that he wasn't asking for any freaking charity. And the doctor stopped talking to him and told Lucas that he'd see him in 2 weeks and he'd give him some exercises to work on in the meantime. Lucas didn't do them, though. And 2 weeks later, just before school was about to start again after Christmas vacation, we went up to Kensington again, and the doctor had an eye doctor waiting too. My father said he wasn't going to be gypped and that he hadn't bought any money, so if he's had that. The eye doctor, though, just turned his back on him. He didn't want to hear my father, and he unwrapped the gauze on Lucas's face. And then he turned to my father. Is there anything else? It was the first time my father had seen Lucas without the bandages. It was the first time I had too. There were burns all across his face. Whatever skin was left there was shiny and stretched. His eyebrows and eyelashes were gone, and it looked like for good. And everything was seeping. Everything looked wet and raw. He lost the sky. Christmas, you can guess, at our house wasn't exactly ho, ho, ho either. On Christmas Eve, my father went someplace with Ernie Echo, and Lucas didn't want to go to midnight mass, so Christopher stayed with them. And then just my mom and I went. If it hadn't been for the ham that Mr. Ballard sent home with all his employees, I think we would have celebrated with thawed hamburgers. Presents? Do you think we got any of those? Forget it. So I went to St. Ignatius, and it was cold and damp, like it usually was, outside and inside. Except inside there were more candles lit than you'd think would be fit for a single church. Up front there were two balsam trees, and there was a scent mixed with the waxy smell of candles. And there was a cradle beside the altar, a blue cloth draped over it. And there was a choir of perfect boys in perfect white robes with perfect combed hair, singing in the perfect notes like everything was perfect. And I thought of Lucas back home in his wheelchair, and so I couldn't understand it when my mom turned to me during Hark the Herald Angels Sings and said, "What a wonderful Christmas this is." I shivered at that. Even with all those candles, it was still cold. But that wasn't the only time I shivered. I shivered late on the afternoon when Christopher carried Lucas up to bed and got him in and covered him. Then he would lie him awake and listen to his dreams. And I would see the young boy with the broken straw hats, the burning huts, the girl's hands. My lay, I was there. I thought about those drawings of Coach Reed. Then Lucas would try to turn over, and there would be a low moan, and Christopher would get up, and I knew Lucas was awake in the dark, and he carried around with him all the time. "What can I do?" Christopher asked. "You weren't there. You can't do anything." None of us knew what to do to make it light for him again. And at the beginning of our first physical science class of the new year, Mr. Ferris set Clarence on the front table and started rocking him. "Do you know, Otis Bottom, what historical event in the sciences will occur in the new year of 1969? Otis Bottom looked like he really didn't want to be back from Christmas break. He could have guessed all day and still not been close. "Doug Swiatek?" Mr. Ferris asked. "The moonshot," Lil whispered. "The moonshot," I said. "Thank you, Lil Spicer. Yes, the moonshot. Apollo 8 has circumnavigated the moon and descended 69.8 miles over the lunar surface. Think of that. From the very beginning of human consciousness, we have looked at the moon and wondered what it would be like to walk on it. Well, in this year, 1969, what man has wondered about for thousands and thousands of years, you may be able to see on your television screens. It is our first step into our solar system. It is our first step out into the galaxy." At this, Clarence was really rocking. I'm not lying. "So what are they trying to find there?" Otis Bottom was trying to recover. "Oh, Otis Bottom, that is the question. What are they going to find? Who knows? Maybe everything will be exactly what we expect. Maybe everything will be a surprise. But one day soon, man will walk across that soil of the lunar landscape and will be a sign of our progress. In a time when it doesn't seem as if we're making any progress anywhere else, this, ladies and gentlemen, is a sign of tremendous possibility. And that, Otis Bottom, is perhaps the best answer to your question, that they're going to find possibility there. I thought about Lucas in his own darkness. What did he like to see again? I went through the rest of my day in a kind of daze. I mean, the moon! Possibility! How exciting it was! Geez, the moon. In January, all Coaches Read classes started their new unit in PE, physical fitness and endurance. We were going to have a whole lot of tests to see how many sit-ups we could do in 4 minutes and how many push-ups and squat thrusts and leg lifts and chin-ups, along with timed 100-yard dashes and mile runs. We were supposed to compare ourselves to the Presidential Council on Physical Fitness goals that all American boys should be trying to reach so we wouldn't die of heart attack someday. So that period, we went practicing the correct way to do push-ups and sit-ups. And after that, we took turns holding each other's ankles and counting sit-ups or holding fists beneath one another so that you could tell how fast your chest had to go to do a good push-up. And we got timed in a trial run. It was about as exciting as it sounds, too. Do you know how that snowy heron has its beak pointed out of the world? How it doesn't care that the hunter is about to come up on him on the path? How he looks at the hunter, he says, so how he just looks at that hunter and he says, "So what?" How he sees possibility. After class, when everyone was headed into the locker room, I stepped up into Coach Reed's office. He was sitting at his desk, which was covered with presidential fitness charts of lots of little spaces needing filled in. "Hello," I said. "What do you want?" he said. "I saw some of your drawings. You're pretty good," I said. He looked at his face down. He put his face down into the clipboard. Then he looked at me with suspicious eyes. "So what?" "You drew the war," I said. Coach Reed not saying anything. His hand pressing down on the clipboard, pressed it back into his desk. "My brother was there too. He's back now." There was a long minute passing. "No, he's not. No one ever really comes back from Vietnam. Not really." He picked up the clipboard and he held it against his chest. "He's not reading the letters he gets." Coach Reed nodded. "He needs someone who knows what it was like. Maybe you could help him." Coach Reed looked at me and I looked at the clipboard. "Maybe you need somebody too," I said. "Get out of here, Swiatek. I'm busy." His sergeant voice was back. "I could help," I said. He laughed, but not a happy laugh. "Help? I could take down, some of your charts. I could write down everyone's names and keep track of where they start, the kind of progress they make, where they finish, stats like that. I could really help you out." Coach Reed got up and sat on the back of his desk. "Why are you being so helpful?" "Do you want me to do it or not?" "Not." "Okay. Wait a minute. Let me think about it. Go get changed. I'll let you know when you come back." "Okay." I nodded. When I came back, the door was closed, but on the door was a note. "Swiatek, start with the second period stats," it said. So I stayed after school to start. Mr. Powell, I don't think the Audubon had this right. I mean, about the hunter. Do you think he's wrong? He's in the wrong place in the picture? No, I don't think the hunter should be in the picture at all. What would you have put there instead? I would put another heron. He's just seen her and he's going to fly over to say hi. Well, then it would be a very different story. What do you think, Lil? She came over and looked at the picture, and then she took my hand. Do you know what it feels like to have Lil Spicer take your hand? It feels like what the astronauts will feel like when they step onto the moon for the very first time. It will feel like what happens if Coach Reed rang the doorbell at the dump some afternoon and sat down to talk to my brother Lucas. It feels like knowing that Principal Petey was wrong about what he said about me. That I did have value. That teachers did care about me. It felt like laying a missing bird picture back where it was supposed to be. And it felt like someone seeing what a chump you are and getting you a cold Coke anyway. It felt like possibility. Guys, this one went a little long, so I'm going to stop us here for today, but I hope everyone enjoyed this classroom edition, and everybody have a good one.